Hi, welcome and good evening. Firstly, thank you for being with us tonight. Tonight, I would like to welcome Mária Hlavajová, founder, general, and artistic director of Netherlands-based institution BAK, Basis voor Actuele Kunst. Mária Hlavajová was and is a researcher and an artistic director of numerous research and educational projects and exhibitions such Former West, ongoing project Proposition for Non-Fascist Living, New World Academy, and many others. Her curatorial practice includes Roma Pavilion for Venice Biennale in 2011, Dutch Pavilion for Venice Biennale in 2007, the project Borderline Syndrome for Manifesta Free and others. She edited and co-edited publications such Posthuman Glossary, Proposition for Non-Fascist Living, Towards the Naniet, Art as Public Practice, and is a co-founder of the cultural network Transit. I will kindly ask you, dear viewers of this lecture, please try to have your cameras on so we don't need to watch blank screens. I will also ask you to have your microphones muted. Please feel free to ask questions directly to the call or to the chat. And now I would like to pass the word to our guest, Mária Hlavajová. Thank you one more time and good evening.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the introduction to Jan and also to Veronica. It's exciting to see you. It's also quite exciting to be close to where I originally come from, albeit in my imagination, because of course I'm sitting in my living room, speaking to you like we all have done over last year and a half. Thank you also for letting your cameras on so that I have a feeling that there are people behind those little thumbnails. And let's go into this. I'm joining the series that you've been engaged with for quite some while already, from an art institution called BAK, B-A-K, which stands in Dutch for Basis voor Actuele Kunst, which actually means a basis for the art of now. An institution I founded 21 years ago in the meantime and have had the privilege to work with ever since. So I am going to speak from within this institutional perspective, albeit an institutional perspective that wanted to always challenge something we call institutional perspective. And I've been always excited about institutions, including Transit that I co-founded also a long time ago, and which is quite remarkable, or has been quite remarkable network of art institutions. Anyway, so when I talk about basis, a base, I'm thinking of a place where art is not taking some sort of primary or privileged position, but it's a place where art means theory meets social practice, social action, if you will. For the lack of a better word, I wouldn't know how to call it in a better way in English that we have in our disposal, but perhaps activism, perhaps advocacy, I don't quite know, but we operate in the convergence between art, theory, scholarship, and social action. So if I speak from within the institutional perspective, it's not exhibitions that would kind of hijack our imagination or dictate what we're doing, although we do exhibitions as well. But it's more kind of long-term trajectories that engage practitioners from various walks of life, if you will, that together in the collectivity try to think about how things are, So the idea of thinking, imagining how things could be different, how things could be otherwise, and not leaving it there, but also trying to see whether these alternative imaginaries could be enacted, lived, if you will, as it were. Now, if Bach is very often seen as a place where art and politics meet, I think it is quite true. Of course, provided that we have shared understanding of what politics really is. But I envision an art institution that is politically driven or driven by the urgencies of the world as a sort of a space where you can prefigure the world you want, right? So it's not the world away from you that you critique in a way, but you imagine another world and see whether you as an institution can be that imagined world in small. This is a huge challenge, however, but there is one largest urgency that has kind of dictated or shaped what we've been doing, and I'm going to quote it. It's from a Barcelona-based philosopher, Marina Garcés. And Marina Garcés speaks about the notion of honesty with the real, to be honest with reality. So what kind of art, what kind of institution, what kind of practices from our field will you end up with if you're honest with the real? And this is what the philosopher Marina Garcés says, and I quote here: honesty with the real is the virtue that defines the material power of art that is engaged with the problems of time and of a world we all share. It is not defined by its themes. In other words, it's not about something. It is not defined by its themes, by its processes, or by its places, but by the power of its involvement and by its yearnings, desires, if you will, desires or yearning for truth as an important part, a yearning for us, some sort of collectivity one belongs to, and a yearning for the world. I'll leave this quotation around honesty with the real hanging there a little bit, and I'm going to move forward. I am going to make lots of shortcuts because I want to share quite a lot with you, hoping that this will provide quite a lot of prompts for our conversation at the end of this gathering. And I'm going to organize my thoughts in three kind of extended notes, if you will. And this is the first one to begin from. And I titled this is Crisis. The idea of this is to actually try to articulate where do we talk from when we talk about the now or art of the now, as I introduced when I introduced the name of the institution, the base for the art of the now. And of course, the notion of crisis is one of the most problematic words. We recycle the word crisis continuously, and one could see it as a vanity of every age. Every age finds itself to be in the state of crisis. So I thought I would go into quite known citation, quite known quote that defines what crisis is. And I'm going to turn to Antonio Gramsci, a philosopher, a political philosopher, and this is a quotation from the prison notebooks. Don't get confused, it was published in 1971, but the quote is somewhere mid-1920s, so 100 years ago. And this is what Gramsci says: the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. It's a very well-known quote, so I'm quite sure you came across this, not the least in the writings of lots of philosophers, including Zizek, Nancy Fraser, and others. Now this quote looks very simple, right? There is the old that is dying, and we wait for the new to come. However, one could do a semester on a deep reading of this quote, and I'm not going to offer that, a semester of the deep reading of this particular citation, but I want to ask you to read it with me one more time. So the crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying. The old is dying. So what this sentence says is that it has not died yet, but it's endlessly hovering in this point of death. It's just about to die, but it cannot go. It's continuously in this process of failing, of decline, but it cannot die. It is dying in the process of dying. On the other hand, you have the new that cannot be born. So it doesn't quite say we just wait, you know, but it's this non-appearance of the new, something that late Mark Fisher talked about a lot. The non-appearance of the new that is unable to come, unable to advance, the new that is incapable of breaking through and thus is basically unavailable. The true crisis then is not that overused shorthand, like, oh, I'm in a crisis, or oh, we are in the period of crisis. To every discomfort of the live world, where everything seems to be in the state of crisis, from economy to society to politics to culture to education, etc. But that this twilight place squeeze between these two processes in different directions, the old that is dying, the new which cannot be born, which essentially are in irreconcilable conflict. These are two temporalities, two different notions of time, one that is leaving and one that cannot come. So we're in this kind of gap in between these two that exhaust one another and cancel one another, negate one another, and they deliver us to the variety of morbid symptoms. Some refer to this period as the time of monsters, that is interregnum. And thus, I would like to take this from here and take a couple of notions from this really quick reading of this quote, just taking away into our conversation, specifically this notion of time, the old is dying, the new cannot be born, and we squeeze between these two processes, where this present moment, so envisions, confronts us with the exhaustion of time. The time is exhausting and is essentially not moving, or maybe even cancellation of time. Yeah, and you probably came across of this, like this endless present. Things are not moving. A lot of things are happening, but there's no progression. There's nothing is really moving. And to return to Marina Garces, from whom I started when I talk about honesty of the real, she talks actually that we find ourselves in the end of time, but not just end of time as every other philosopher would tell you, but according to her, when it is said that the time is ending, this does not mean some abstract empty time, but the livable time. And the livable time she defines as the time when we, the humans, could still intervene and shape our conditions of life. And I think this idea that we find ourselves in this not moving, in this stinky air, when things are not moving, that it's the end of time where we can intervene into, has to very much to do with the fact that there are other elements that actually write history today. And you could think about critters, you can think about viruses today that actually are those elements, phenomena that are writing history for us, with very few kind of tools at our hands that we could shape, time. So what happens to art in this situation? Because the action within this notion of the end of time, when we cannot intervene, is not this collective project of politics, that there is a horizon towards which we want to move. You know, there's imagination, shared horizon of social change and future prospects. This is not what we're capable of doing. As I said, we lost a capacity to intervene into present moment. But rather, the action is driven by the instincts of survival, if you will, under duress, conceived as not as an experiment, and that also counts for art in a way. So it's not an experiment, but perhaps what you could think of as emergency rescue and disaster care. And I thought I would bring at least one example of an artwork that to me feels like emergency rescue and disaster care. This gigantic sculpture of Lawrence of Quinn that some of you may have seen at the Venice Biennial in 2019. It's gigantic hands trying to support these crumbling buildings in Venice. This is nearly palliative care, the care of those really dying. And of course, we know the trope of no future. Specifically, if some of you do come or belong to punk culture, which is the school of politics I come from, but of course, this idea of no future is really actual at the moment when the triumphant conditions of late have succeeded in the goal to condemn us to near precarity of just about everything, right? By destroying the infrastructure of livability. So think healthcare, social security, housing, public education, culture institutions, water system, public parks, etc., 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 as well as critically, of course, and you young generation will understand that, destroying the livability of the planet. And, you know, this question that whether it is too late to do something actually is something you can just open in a newspaper and you know, somewhere there will be a header in newspaper or maybe in your whatever social media feed asking, is it too late? Even if you look at the formal kind of documents of organizations such as United Nations, they would give the planet, the society, the humankind just a couple of years till 2030 to fix the carbon dioxide situation. If we do not act now, there's no way we can intervene into the livability of the planet after this date. And just a funny trivia that I observed since really Cold War times in the 1970s. I don't know whether you're familiar with this, but the bulletin of the atomic scientists that every January says how far we are from midnight, from complete disaster of the planet. And in January 2021, just few months back, it was set to 100 seconds to midnight. So the doom moment is impending. Started in 1947, this was after Second World War, it was set at 7 minutes to midnight. Most optimistic, I think, in 1991 to 17 minutes to midnight after the fall of Berlin Wall, if you will, and the end of Cold War partitioning of the world, but it's set to 100 seconds to midnight now. I think it's really important to understand that this has to do mainly with the impending nuclear catastrophe combined with the effects of global warming. You could think that it's pushed to 100 seconds to midnight, mainly because COVID-19 pandemic, but not quite. They say, though lethal on a massive scale, this particular pandemic is not an existential threat. Of course, this is not to downplay its effect on the humankind, but so its consequences are grave and will be lasting, but it will not obliterate the civilization. Still, the pandemic serves as an important wake-up call to see specifically how misinformation and specifically the fiddling with truth, right? The misinformation, or if you will, infodemic, the pandemic, informational pandemic, which is actually definitional for this moment, not the least because as Hannah Arendt said in 1951 in The Origins of Totalitarianism already, if there is no way that society can establish what is true and what is fictional, this is precisely an interstice, an opening for fascisms to come in. And this is precisely the moment we find ourselves in at this very moment. And thus, if I were to identify some takeaways from this node number 1, introduction, if you will, as to where do I speak from this moment of crisis, how does it look like? There are probably 2 very important things to take with us. One is the dysfunction of the information system. And again, there probably are many digital natives amongst you, which render society essentially unable to deal with any major or minor challenges. And amongst those major challenges is really the return of fascism in our midst, which is the moment of post-truth, like it was 100 years ago when Antonio Gramsci wrote his quote that I brought up. Like it is now, the incapacity of society to establish some basic understanding, shared understanding of truth, is the moment that is an invitation to fascism to return to our midst. And the second part would be that these conditions we share today doom us to endless present, right? There is the notion of time becomes extraordinarily important. So not merely a space, but time has been colonized. And I would like to take these two really important takeaways, in my opinion, the infodemics and the crisis of time, into my second note, which I named Propositions for Non-Fascist Living. As was it introduced in the beginning, this is also a name for a long-term research project at BAC. Let me say a couple of things about this, and specifically also in relation to the crisis. For, as I already stressed, that's not a coincidence that the Gramsci's ideas around interregnum feel so relevant to the present moment. After all, they were written in the rise of historical fascism. Now, these propositions for non-fascist living understand fascism in their historical guise, so historical fascism, as well as historical iterations. One of the big issues around the notion of fascism is that it disguises itself in such a way that we tend to think that fascism is the matter of the past, right? It's the 20th century phenomena. Fascisms always come from uncertain futures. I think this is something what we need to understand, that we can speak of fascism at present time. Think about contemporary genocide on multiple population, or ecocide as violations on the principles of environmental justice. So ecocide being the 21st century version of genocide, causing extensive damage or destroying ecosystems and, as I already mentioned, livability of the planet. So fascism, if you will, in their expanded sense, historically, geographically, and substantively, as a cluttered composite of multiple, on one hand, large-scale state, corporate, dictatorial, militaristic, and destructive conducts, and on the other hand, micro-authoritarian impulses colonizing the everyday through patriarchy, misogyny, bigotry, xenophobia, racism, but also digital fascism, eco-fascism, etc., and many other culture codes in between these. So I want us to think this imminent, impending impending around the notion of fascism in this kind of extended sense. This long-term project Propositions for Non-Fascist Living, however, is not about fascism, and this is something really important. I would like to stress that fascism is not subject of this program, and in larger sense, it's not. It suggests how contemporary art, as politics, operates. It kind of tries to circumnavigate this danger of representation. So I speak about the ills of the world, and instead the ills of the world, let's say fascism, so-called refugee crisis, or what other crises you can think about. They are not our subjects, and they shouldn't be subject of politically engaged art, if you will. They should be driving forces. They should be what drives us to do something about it, rather than represented by, let's say, point the camera at it, or write or speak about it. So I want to see impending fascism as driving force, as what brings us together to not talk about fascism, but to propose how do we circumnavigate it. So how do we envision the world that is decidedly void of fascism? This is extraordinarily difficult. It's quite easy to talk about fascism. It's quite easy, and specifically in the art world, enjoys itself as a critical crowd, to point the finger or a camera, if you will, at these matters. It's far more difficult to imagine the current conditions through propositions into something else. But this is where prefigurative, propositional, prefigurative agency of art really is. And thus the ethical and political foundations of the project, such as Propositions for Non-Fascist Living, lie in the tension of wanting to be in opposition, to resist something like fascist predicament, but at the same time be generative of new options. How can we do things? What can we do in order to navigate fascism or prevent it to enter our lives? Yeah. So what it does is bringing resistance and creativity together in one. Resistance in its own, or being in opposition to something, is not enough. It's too late to be just in opposition. I think what we need to do, and this is how I introduced back in the beginning, we need to think how things are in the world. We need to imagine, propose how they could be otherwise. We cannot stop there. We also need to live these imaginaries as if it were possible. And I think this is where political and ethical responsibility of the field of art really is. So it's to think, imagine, and actualize the alternatives, the propositions, if you will, in this case for non-fascist living. This notion of non-fascist life we did borrow from philosopher Michel Foucault, from very short introduction to Deleuze and Guattari, for those who are interested. Capitalism and Schizophrenia, where Foucault talks about non-fascist life, not living but life, as, and I quote, art of living counter to all forms of fascism, whether already present or impending. And again, it's not just Hitler and Mussolini, but which mobilized the desires in the 20th century, but fascism in all of us. And this is really difficult to swallow, if you will, but fascism in all of us, I quote further, in our heads and in our everyday behavior, the fascism that causes us to love power, the desire desire the very thing that dominates and exploits us. This is just cover for two books that might be of interest for those who are trying to understand how art can actually negotiate propositions vis-a-vis something as threatening as the impending fascisms today. This is publication Propositions for Non-Fascist Living. It was quite remarkable contributions of these writers, and I run through this just very quickly. And the book called Deserting from the Culture Wars. And again, deserting away from this opposition that culture wars actually put you into, and deserting into a new space where you are the one who established the conditions for the conversation in a propositional modality, if you will. And again, I cannot stress this more. This is a key method through which we at BAC operate, and through which I believe practices that are engaging with the urgencies of the world must really accommodate the propositional modality. So thinking how things are, imagining how they could be otherwise, and living that imagination. So enacting it, materializing, or at least helping materializing it. Now, we at BAC think of these propositions as propositions to be found through assemblies. So we don't think, for example, on exhibitions as, you know, an exposition of a number of art objects with certain kind of notion of aura and distance and objective distance from the works of art, but we think of exhibitions and all our projects as assemblies. An assembly is not just of people, but of course of people, ideas, objects, thoughts, relations in makeshift constellation shaped by the shared urgencies. So we come together because we are driven together by certain urgencies, because we are propelled by these urgencies to do something about them. Not to put them on display, but to do something about them, which means that artistic practice are really about intervention into the real lived world, driven by, and there you go, I'm repeating the quote from which I started, yearning for truth for us and for the world. These are just few propositions. Of course, this is something you can also revisit at BAC website. Everything open source, everything kind of archived in the digital archive. For example, this is from a collaboration with Jonas Staal on the question, what is assemblism? Dutch-based artist Jonas Staal. Art as a commitment to social, ecological, technological culture change, if you will. Deserting from the culture war, instituting otherwise. Or the most recent one in January, which was about mobilization and visibility as to what is the role of art within the current mobilizations within various social movements. Now, all these assemblies, all this coming together have one thing in common. And these are the instances where people come together in what I call anticipatory learning. It's not education the way we know it. You know, a museum has an exhibition and then sets up an education program to kind of educate those who are not educated enough in the view of a museum to learn about the subject. Anticipatory learning is this coming together, and again, people, objects, ideas, and relations amongst them. So an art object in the exhibition, for example, is part of that assembly. Yeah, so it's what you call the post-human perspective, where human is not the only agent within this kind of a constellation. So anticipatory learning is a form of radical pedagogy where you come together to learn what does not yet exist. And that's where art meets politics. It's part of the genealogy of radical pedagogies. I'll elaborate on a concrete example in a second. But you have radical pedagogies from Gramsci, Brecht, Freire, for example, the pedagogies of the oppressed, up to socially just pedagogies today in Rosie Braidotti, Donna Haraway, Catherine Barat, and others. It's quite fascinating field, and we from the art world tend to look at pedagogies as something that is in service of art, if you will, or service of institutions. However, this notion of assembling for anticipatory learning is to create conditions where political subjectivities that do not exist can emerge. And they are actually moments to pre-enact, prefigure alternative possibility of being together otherwise, if you will. The outcome is unknowable in advance, unlike those other pedagogical techniques that come after the fact. So I know something and I come to teach you, which would be pedagogy for the public, or like Freire from the 60s, 70s, pedagogy of the public, where public comes together, where everybody alternates from between the positions of teaching and learning. This is something else. This is where art meets politics, where performative imagination takes place. So people come together, people and other members of the assembly, if you will, in order to together learn what does not yet exist, learn together a possibility for a future world, if you will, in the moment where the conjunction, the capitalist, neoliberal capitalism tells us there is no alternative, and when time stands still. So this coming together is to envision another world and act it out, temporarily facilitated by the artists and artworks, if you will, and the art institution. But at the same time, it is to envision different chronopolitics, politics of time. So if we're in a situation where time no longer moves, or if it moves in our head It's the hegemonic futurity of the West, if you will, from past into present into future, which essentially is also useless because it does not identify some distinct chronological period, because neoliberal present kind of predicts the same neoliberal present just tomorrow. So this alternative pedagogy of anticipatory learning is trying to envision how tomorrow can be something else than the name for the same. Yeah. So how can there be substantive change? Change. In other words, this anticipatory learning is an instance of not just imagination, but performative imagination, as it puts this never-ending present in question and under pressure, so that the fiction joins the world in order to become the world. That's performative imagination. I think only art really can do this. There are various theories around this, and I very, very often and with pleasure look at the Dutch theories of pedagogy, Geert Biesta, who speaks about pedagogy by interruption. So pedagogy not like, let's get together because we agree with one another, not at all. Pedagogy where artist is an interrupter. When the artist interrupts the normal course of think of the regular life that you have, and allows you, by entering into the artwork, leave your unfreedoms behind you, although temporarily, in order to join with others about speculating and living that other world. So the pedagogy of speculation, creating community in which freedom might appear. So you leave the unfreedom behind, unfreedoms, if you're aware of those, behind you, and you temporarily join in others in freedom in a way, and according to Biesta, because you're allowed to speak your own voice. Yeah, so you leave the kind of identities you perform within the kind of precarious life behind you, and enter in the situation where some improbable alternatives become possible. I could go endlessly into this pedagogy of interruption, because it's quite fascinating from a theoretical perspective. But I want to go into a concrete example, and I spend last 10 minutes of my time with a concrete project of something that I do consider to be such instance of anticipatory learning in the artistic project, where people come together in order to think how things are, imagine how they could be otherwise, and living them as if it were possible. This is an exquisite instance, in my opinion, of this anticipatory learning, a project that we ran at the back in 2019-2020, called the Trainings for the Not Yet. However, I wanted to take you to a very concrete project called Trainings for the Not Yet, and I already introduced that it is, of course, a training, so an instance of this anticipatory learning, coming together to learn together what does not yet exist. In other words, think about the possible future, imagine how it could take place, and actually rehearse it together, train the muscle for it to take place. So I already said that the subtitle or hint about this project was that's an exhibition as a series of trainings. And it's a huge challenge when it comes to how do we envision exhibitions actually as normally a sum of objects sharing space together. Anyway, these Trainings for the Not Yet were a sort of an assembly, again, of people, communities, ideas, objects, rehearsals, art, shared food, research, talks, politics, performances, screening, teachings, learnings, etc., etc. It started from a question I posed to the artist Janne van Heijswijk: how to be together otherwise. Not just how to live together otherwise, but how to be together otherwise. Very much in this post-human condition. I don't mean after human, but post-human as a process where you decenter the human from the center of attention as human agency that you know, usurps rights to just about everything, including destroying the living environment and the planet. Now, Jeanne van Heijswijk started responding to this question by putting in motion huge kind of sweeping process of invitation and interconnection of individuals, groups, and communities and artworks, and specifically those engaged in concrete struggles against structural violence and unequal distribution of resources in today's society. So she would bring together multiple collaborators in a constellation that probably looks very much like this sculpture. This is sculpture by herself, works, typologies, and capacities from 2004. And of course, this is reenacted in 2019, reinstalled, and we refer to it as a potato sculpture, of course. Jeanne researched various types of potato and chose types of potato that actually corresponds to our time, such as sustainable, brought from abroad, etc., etc., etc. And for her, she would bring this together in this constellation, and internally for her, each of these clusters of potatoes would actually represent a sort of a project that she engaged in. And I do not have a good photo, but this is a photo from the beginning of the project. But of course, because of the humidity and temperature in the space, each potato started to propagate, started to kind of, you know, chemes going in various connections and creating new connections beyond what this sculpture that was at back in this way imagine itself. And of course, there are tons of connotations to this, specifically potato being a sustenance food across most of the planet, etc., etc., etc. Anyway, I'm going to show you a couple of images from this project, but with a little caveat. You're going to look at the project. You're going to see people in action, in training, if you will. Yet what's really happening in the place, in the space, is not something that's archivable. It's not something that you can photograph. It's not something I can discuss, I can present to you. It's unarchivable. And I think this is quite important element, again, of these practices of art as politics, if you will, that it escapes a traditional ways how we talk about art. You know, there's an object on display and you can discuss. Because what really is happening, what is being trained, is the particular way of relating between one another, which you cannot articulate, which you cannot show, which you cannot discuss, and certainly you cannot catch in the traditional kind of photography. But what you can think about is to think about the exhibition as a training ground. So a place where you can come together with others to train with one another in various community knowledges that could prepare you for another future. And of course, this employ not that just lecturing, but they employ the body and the mind at the same time in this kind of comprehensive collective public learning project, imagining or practicing the not yet imagined, the not yet articulated contours of another world that we might want to desire. Now, there have been art objects installed in the exhibition. So if you chose to visit an exhibition in relatively traditional way, where you want to encounter art objects, you still could, only you would need to negotiate your way through a number of people throughout the exhibition space training, because in the philosophy of trainings for the not yet, the art object would not be thought in a traditional way, but more as a learning object. So the object that carries the community knowledges that are installed there in the space to touch, to change, to alter, and specifically to learn from, so that we do not need to, if you will, discover the wheel always anew. So this is one of this mobile of interdependency. You can see that if you move and touch any of this part, everything shifts. The notion of interdependency is absolutely crucial. And of course, we know that Western colonial modernity is about the notion of independency. Yeah. So the notion of interdependency and care. However, these objects become most interesting when you really negotiate, moving by them and inhabiting them and learning from them, like in this training for the not yet with Fran Illich, from the Diego de la Vega coffee co-op, looking at the alternative economic models of Zapatistas, for example, or this gathering, for example, with the new women connectors, migrant refugee women who engage with other women, helping to find a way about within the society. Or, for example, this installation, quite important one from Black Quantum Futurism, titled All Time is Local. And many of you may know the Black Quantum Futurism, and I think the practice is quite extraordinarily important for our thinking about the time of interregnum in between the old that is not dying, that cannot die, and the new that cannot be born, squeezed in this kind of stinky, continuous presence in a way. The whole project then, if you think, was about making time when we are out of time, making time together and working in spite of this hegemonic futurity, the hegemonic futurity of Elon Musk's and other of these people, right? The hegemonic futurity reserved for the few, and prescribed to us by capital's calculative machinery, so that we can really move out of the temporal ghettos. And this is how Black Quantum Futurism, the Philadelphia-based Afrofuturist collective, terms the way the master's clock, the clock of the universal model, a modern clockwork universe of Western modernity, how it unevenly distributes space and time, or spatial temporal mobility, agency, and determination. This is a quote from Rashida Phillips, one of the members of the Black Quantum Futurism. And the installation called All Time is Local says, and I quote, like politics and the weather, all time is local. This is how their installation with videos and objects considers time and temporality's intimate relationship to locality. Of course, the installation seeks to disrupt this convention of linear time from past, present, into the future that reign normatively over our lives. And they build on the legacy of the civil rights and Black liberation movements, of course, as well as Black futurist philosophy and aesthetics, to contemplate underexplored histories, nows, and futures, right? The works then celebrate the transformative power of Afro-diasporan philosophy and liberation technologies, such as time travel, that can unlock ancestral memories as much as it retrieves memories from realities that have not yet happened. Yeah, that's the time travel. And it's something quite important to learn from, because here the intersection of futurist mindset, quantum physics, and Black culture traditions of consciousness, time and space, there emerges a not yet, a vista into the impending multiple futures, not hegemonic futures, but multiple futures with a lower case f futures, and a renewed capability to choose and actively create paths and trajectories to reach them. Now, what does this all mean for the art institution? And this is something we're developing currently at BAC, and probably just to conclude and skip a couple of sections because we did lose a little bit of time with the interruption of the linearity of my lecture. And perhaps I stop with this image, which is by Carmen Papalia, who's a legally blind person who was leading this procession through the city as a test of interdependence. How do we really depend on one another? This is, you could see as a training for the not yet of sorts, where he would lead this pack of participants who were all asked to close their eyes and touch a person in front of them, so that Carmen in front of this row would give a signal that we need to go slightly to the left because then there's an obstacle on the road, and every subsequent person would inform the person behind them. And the question is whether in this notion of interdependence you could envision an art institution today that would be there not as a machine of power, the way art institutions and institutions in general operate, but a platform, a base in solidarity with communities. And my proposal, which is currently being developed, as I mentioned, together with a huge number of communities, and mainly with the artist Janne van Heijswijk, who did this project with us. And the words fall short, because imagine kind of 6-7 months of daily trainings with various communities around different sort of knowledges. But my question is as follows: can an art institution function not as that operation of power, but a community portal? And I introduced already the notion of Black quantum futurism and the time travel, and of course the notion of portal is very much coming from this kind of considerations. Somewhere mid-2020, there was a very important book published by Arundhati Roy, and a beautiful Indian thinker, called Azadi, Freedom, Fascism and Fiction. So this is 2020, which, by the way, begins from the epitaph, and I quote, "May tomorrow be more than just another name for today," which is really quite beautiful and important. And she sees current pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, as a portal. And this is the quote that kind of circulates the art world and is really important. I quote from this book, Azadi, Freedom, Fascism, Fiction, from 2020. "Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next." To think the art institution, based on this quote, as a community portal, so I imagine, would allow the communities to step both in and out. So you do not, as an institution, instrumentalize, or as an artist did, for that matter, instrumentalize the community by dissolving it, right? Because you kind of own it or include it as part of your machine, which of course means destroying the community. Communities can only exist so as to the integrity of it as relations, set of relations that are distinct from institutional establishment, are maintained. So the art institution as a community portal would allow the community to step both in and out of the institution as an entryway and exit at once, allowing to live within, again, and against the institution in parallel, engaging thus in this anticipatory learning in the transformation of what's yet to be, and thus indeed speculatively learning with others the visions of times to come, and then letting this fiction, as I already said, meet the world to become the world. And thus, to quickly and perhaps slightly abruptly conclude this lecture, I would like to end with the words of Arundhati Roy, which happen to the words with which she concludes the introduction to her book. And it goes as follows: what lies ahead? Reimagining the world, only that, and that's the task of art today. I leave it here, and maybe this could be opportunity. If I stop sharing, then we can all undo our camera closures. What's the word for it? That we just put our cameras on and see whether this could be a moment we could speak together about a couple of things. What do you think?
Firstly, thank you for the lecture. Let's start with the discussion. I would like to ask you first question. Like it's somehow connected with the thing, like how we can like learn with like how we can learn from the current situation. Like for example, this lecture is made in a collaboration between like 3 institutions. Like we have like 2 academies and 1 cultural institution. So we have like 3 physical organisms. And my question is that like how we can like distribute or dissipate institutions that are somehow centric, or like not centric, but like physically based in the age where the things are starting to be like online, like more global, not focused to physical spaces, etc.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, the question of institutions is complicated because institutions, the way we envisioned it, and specifically the way they issue from Western modernity. And I don't know how Western modernity is taught within the respective institutions, but the notion of institution is a model through a model of distribution of power. Rather than agency to others, right? So one question about dissipation, and I'm excited about the term, and I'll explain why. But the one question about dissipation is what kind of power this institution can engage, because you can have power over. Of course, we know from various philosophers, potestas, that is business of usual of politics, which is destructive power, or you can think of power as potentia, which is enabling, so it's empowerment. So the question about institution is where the power is positioned and how it is being distributed. It's a really important question, because only when you redistribute power from that centric, the notion of being power-centric, only then you can dissipate in a way. And this notion of dissipated institution is something I've been distributing. I've been thinking about quite intensely for many years. How can you decenter art institutions? It's very much something that originates from feminist discourse, the discourse of decentering or off-centering power. Such as post-human discourse also is the discourse of decentering and off-centering the human. So this question of decentering and off-centering is absolutely crucial. You can look, for example, at various publications such as Judith Butler's performative power of the agent of the assembly. I'm improvising the title because I cannot remember it. In other words, how can you assemble across distance, not in physical proximity, right? So what are the bases of being with others beyond the physical assembly, beyond being physically in physical proximity. This is something that art has experimented quite a lot, but at this moment what interests me most is how can you dissipate art institutions in such a way that you can meet people where they are rather than force people to come to where you are. This is all political thought, but we at this very moment at BAC, for example, are thinking of distributing itself to other localities elsewhere in the world, not as a branding exercise like whatever museum in Abu Dhabi or whatever Guggenheim in Abu Dhabi. So not as a branding exercise, but as creating kind of cells with similar material, any material conditions that allows us to operate in the city of Utrecht in the Netherlands to provide similar material and immaterial conditions in other places in the world. This doesn't mean setting up galleries for objects to be presented, but creating conditions within which assemblies of human, non-human, living, non-living, organic, non-organic could take place for anticipatory learning. And I think this is where the largest challenges are. This is doable in various formats. What we do, we setting up research cells in various places at this very moment around the world, where within the research cell, people locally can work in physical proximity in a kind of humble, small constellation, and the connection amongst the cells can be mediated technologically. What would this mean for educational institutions? I really do not know. But I think we need to engage in a lot of institutional thinking today in order to meet the current urgencies. And of course, as an old saying goes, the biggest problem in the world issues from the very fact that we have ancient emotions, emotions that come with people, from whatever beginning of the times, that we have outmoded institutions, and we have absolutely up-to-date, up-to-speed technology. And we operate within these three bodies of emotions, institutions that are not fit for the present, and technology that is kind of, propelling us into extraordinarily difficult hegemonic future. And we torn apart in between these three kind of bodies, elements. And I think also a task of art is figuring out a way how to negotiate between these three, essentially temporality. And thus, I think this notion of temporality that I brought up throughout the lecture is hugely important. Because we think in spatial terms, specifically with the pandemic at this very moment. We cannot be together physically in the same space. It's this kind of spatial imaginary dominates our thinking. But I think we need to understand that not only space, but also time has been colonized. And that decolonizing time is an opportunity to think and act otherwise in the present moment.
Thank you. Please feel free to ask any other questions, or if you are shy, let's write the question into the chat.
Yeah, I will ask a question and kind of follow up on your answer. You already mentioned it also in your talk, and I just want to sort of hear you say or clarify what is the time colonized by, or who is it colonized by, and what can be the antidote to decolonization of time? What sort of values, for example, could decolonize the time or help restructure, recreate the future for us?
Yeah, thank you. It's opening gigantic set of questions, of course. I think the inaccessibility of future possibilities is colonized time means that the future possibilities are inaccessible, right? The Western modernity envisioning this linear time from past to present into the future. I mentioned just before we've been interrupted. Francesco Bifo Berardi, who said, you know, the future, the notion of the future was the biggest lie of the 20th century. There is no future, at least not for the humanity, humankind, if you will. And it's related to what I was talking about, that we are out of time. We're out of a possibility to intervene into how things are going, specifically when it comes to climate change, which is running faster than our capacity to react. Now, the way I formulated it, it sounds as if it was the agency of its own, but of course, to a great extent, it's the complexity of our own doing. So, and of course, the Western modernity being extractivist, capitalist modernity is what really caused this situation. So we find ourselves in a situation where future is inaccessible to majority of population, if you will, given the precarity of lives, specifically young generation, finding itself in. The question is how to go about this, whether to demand access to that futurity, and various theories called it really hegemonic futurity, because it's what's given through kind of understanding of how neoliberal capitalism operates. So it's reserved for the few, and majority are being held in this, you know, utopian thinking. So could one rethink futurity and reclaim it essentially by other means? And that notion of the not yet is reclaiming it, where you traverse amongst these blocks of past, present, and future in a much more fluid and creative way, so that you create patches of possibilities of another life, nonetheless. Not against the impossibility of the future, but in spite of this. And that would essentially go hand in hand in creating kind of patches of possibilities to live post-capitalist life, if you will. So it's figuring out alternative economies, it's that are respectful towards not merely human life, but life of other species, etc., etc. So it's an extremely complex operation. There's no one trajectory to say. It's a complex kind of hand in hand where artists cannot act themselves on their own, but always in the interdependencies with others. But this logic of not being against, but being in spite of, is very important in this. Yeah? So that's propositional modality that I was in a way stressing. This needs to be always necessarily multi-talented, if you will. I want to avoid the term discipline. You know, it's again an invention of Western modernity that we divide knowledge in certain disciplines. You cannot resolve climate change by appealing to just climate theorists. You know, you need to create a broad coalition of interdependencies to act in sync with one another. There's a complex, and something that really annoys my students whenever I get into it. Art is complicit in all the ills of the world. Yeah, that my students at least always tend to think we're the good guys. Yeah, of course not. Of course we are not. You know, we contribute to lots of other things, such as pollution, etc., etc. But also what we so cherish from the 60s and 70s, from the art of last century, the utopian visions of the future are for me problematic, are part of this lie about the future, you know, kind of dreaming a future rather than making it. And there is something that quite irritates me anytime I say this, because, you know, there's a belief that the notion of art is just merely dream. And I think under ideal conditions, I would go with that, but we're out of time. In other words, when I hear my students saying, you know, I don't have answers, I am here to pose questions. No, we don't have time for questions. We're beyond that. We're out of time for questions. We're out of time for utopias only. We need to think how things are, imagine how they could be otherwise, how that could be otherwise, and do it at the same time. Otherwise, there's no way. So the practices I'm looking at are those practices that really intervene in live world one-on-one. And it's happening, think forensic architecture, you know, practices, for example, or Jonas Stahl with his current project of collectivizing Facebook, or trainings for the Nordic that I was showing.
Thank you a lot. It was a very inspiring answer.
Now to figure out how to do it, of course.
I would like to, I like that you point to the thing that we are not only the good guys. So what I want to ask, like, what is our responsibility toward the technology? Like on one hand, we are here meeting because of the technology, and technically it's like solving a lot of problems, but ideologically, like we saw a few minutes ago, and also the invisible effects of technology, like production of technology, carrying cloud systems, etc., etc. So maybe like from the artistic perspective, like yeah, like what's the responsibility of the art world, like toward the technology and like visioning the future?
Yeah, I wish I knew how to answer this question. I think techno-realism versus techno-utopianism, some sort of a ground of understanding. I mean, we need to understand technology. This is really hugely important. But I think if you ask me where the responsibility, it's complicated, and the notion of responsibility of the artist. Again, a lot of my students just deny that. But I think in this version of capitalism, which you can refer to as logistical capitalism or computational capitalism, where essentially only that which is computational tends to matter, I think the role or responsibility of art is to focus on the incalculable, to highlight a crucial importance that reducing the world to the calculable. In other words, what fits mathematical formula, that it's absolute reduction of life, and that we cannot actually allow. It's not merely a responsibility of the art world. You cannot name it that way, but how can we, in a meaningful way, point out to the incalculable as the way to go forward, while we fully understand the calculable? Yeah, so it's not some sort of utopian like opposition of incalculable to calculable, but propositional way where you again want to resist calculation, sheer calculation, but being creative with it at the same time. So again, propositional modality is the way to go about it, which includes knowing how technologies work, understanding the direction, and see, can we work propositionally with it? Maybe others have some questions.
Yeah, maybe. Can I ask you about like when you were talking about the trainings for Not Yet? So like you are now in this, or we see all these urgencies. We know that we need immediate reactions on them, and like I think the training mode is like super important, because it's like preparing us for some moments which can be like some like tipping points or some moments when the change will come and we can be ready for them and we know like where to intervene to make the change happen. But I'm thinking like what's next, like how we can go further and not just like do the training and prepare for these moments, but like how to like, I don't know, make like the institutions ready also for the changes, to like intervene in the right moment, or like, yeah, what's the next steps after the trainings?
Yeah, I think the idea of the trainings is not training for the training's sake, but actually take these knowledges from the training and implementing into live world. So it's creating stamina and resistance and proposition. In other words, the notion of the training is to prepare yourself, not just resist the precarities of the world, but propositionally build new conditions for the world. And that may involve new institution making. I really cannot say, because what emerges from the training is unpredictable. And it's not something I, as a director of the institution, can say. You know, we as a community institution, as a community portal, can offer a platform that you enter. You know, if you think of a portal, it's an entryway. You can leave your unfreedoms behind you, unfreedoms of the precarious life. You enter temporarily into kind of interdependent anticipatory learning with others. You train yourself, you train the muscle, but you don't lose the muscle when you cross the portal back into the real life. Maybe you meet your unfreedoms again, but you may be better equipped to deal with them. So it's not that skills you obtain within this training stay in the institution; they go with you back into the world. So you create knowledges and reservoirs of resilience to deal with the situation. That's one thing, and you create by understanding interdependencies, you create networks and collectivities on which you can rely in the real world, if you will. You may not know those people otherwise until you meet them. So this is the idea behind that, is to perhaps learn how the not yet could look like, and return to your unfreedoms and build that new not yet out there. This is when I use this poetic world, think a fiction of the world until that fiction becomes the world. And that's why fictional thinking, speculation, imagination is crucial. It's very different from utopian thinking we know from the 20th century. It's like, oh, you dream, you imagine, but the definition of utopia is not to be realized. So you could think of these trainings for the not yet as practicable utopias, if you will. Utopias that are knowledges. I really shouldn't use the term utopia here, but the knowledges that you take with you. And it's not just knowledge that enters through your mind, right? It's really muscle. It's embodied knowledge. It's in your body that you can live through, and that makes you more resilient in real life, if you will. Of course, this is speculative. You know, if you ask me, can I show you the evidence? Probably I could think of something, but it's a speculative proposition how to go about this moment of a standstill where art has been reduced to palliative care. You know, they remember those hands kind of supporting the building. It's such a powerless image. You know, it tries to kind of show strength of the art world and artwork and artistic practices, but essentially it's just trying to keep the crumbling world together.
So I think if there are like no other questions, I will really thank you for the discussion and for your presentation. So one more time, thank you all for being part of this. Thank Mrs. Hlavajová to give the lecture and to help the discussion. And I hope we see each other in better futures.
Yes, let's hope for that. And I look forward to it. Thank you for all of you who returned and stayed.
Thank you very much for your time and your inspiring talk.
Thank you and have a nice evening.